Hello, Bardo. Hello, Sebastian from Peru. Diamond. Hello, Blue Green. And Diamond. This is not a free form. Hello, Aryan. So I'm just going to stick with the topic. All right. So the topic is what's wrong with us, according to Vedic psychology. So first of all, you may have never heard of Vedic psychology because you may have only heard of Vedic astrology. And you might think I'm just making up this term, just like they made up the term Vedic astrology. Actually, when we talk about Vedic psychology, what we're talking about is everywhere in the Vedic texts and associated schools of thought that has to do with how the mind works, which is quite a lot. And the single best, concise, and explicit explanation of how the mind works is in a book called Yoga-Sutra, which is written, the author is Patanjali, and the main commentator is Vyas. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at today. According to Yoga-Sutra, or according to Vedic psychology, what's wrong with us? Now you might think, there's nothing wrong with us. And if that's what you think, then fine. That's cool. But Vedic psychology is operating on the premise that there's something wrong with us, because whether you notice it in your personal life or in your family life or in your community or in your nation or internationally, it's pretty hard to avoid noticing that there's something wrong. That thing that is wrong, that wrongness or that problematicness is called klesha. Klesha means like a problem. And so what is the problem? Right? So now, hello from Disneyland, from Nori. The audio is a bit low. Well, it's probably because I'm speaking low, because it's early in the morning. I'm kind of scared to wake people up. All right, so let's look at what is wrong with us according to Vedic psychology. What is the klesh? Well, let me turn on this visual here. Boom, boom. There we go. So this is the first thing. According to the Vedas, there's this klesha, or this problem called Avidya. Now, most people who have heard the term before kind of haven't really thought exactly about what it means. There is an exact definition in the Yoga-Sutra. Avidya is the opposite of vidya. So it's actually literally the opposite of vidya. Vidya is, sometimes people say it's knowledge, but vidya is like accuracy of information, which is a big issue these days. Accuracy of information is the main problem. It is not just avidya is not just inaccuracy in information, but it's actual opposite of accuracy in information. So we can call it inverted perception. It's an inversion in the interpretation of the information that we're receiving into the consciousness. So in other words, you feel that you are pointing west, and to you it's west, but actually it's east. That's avidya. You feel that you are looking up, but actually you're looking down. Something seems hot, but really it's actually cold. That's avidya. It's not just like ignorance. Ignorance means you don't know something, or maybe you haven't been exposed to something. Avidya means to get something exactly oppositely wrong. Right, so the classic things are anitya, nitya, asuchi, suchi, suk, duk, and anatma atma, to think that things are lasting or enduring when they're not. They're very temporary. To think that things are clean when actually they're dirty. Think that things are pleasant when actually they're painful. And to think that things are relevant when they're irrelevant. Those are the key avidyas that are at the root. This is the root or the cause of our problems. So it comes down to the most important perception is the perception of who you are. So the bottom line of avidya is, instead of you think you're pointing west, but actually you're pointing east, it's actually you think that you are something, but you are not that thing. So it's a misunderstanding of what the word I refers to. That's the root cause of all the problems, according to Vedic psychology. It's a misunderstanding of ego. Please understand that this is Vedic psychology. It's not that ego is the root of all the problems. It's that the misapplication of ego. It's not that there's no such thing as an I, but it's that the I is on something which is not I, anatma atma. Now, based on this, there are going to be 4 other problems that pop up and sometimes become more intense and sometimes become less intense, but are always basically there, and which are the ones that we feel more often. We don't usually feel the avidya because you don't even know really that it's there. Although the avidya is the root of all the problems, it's not really the one that we're directly suffering. So let's look at what they say comes next. After avidya evolves or enables this next problem, which is called asmita. Basically, asmita is infatuation. Actually, this is I'm pretty satisfied with this translation of the word. It conveys what it really means. It's infatuation. But in this particular context, the infatuation that's produced by avidya is going to be that the perception is the perceiver. So remember, avidya is I am what I'm not. Like you see red, but it's actually blue. You see you, but it's actually not you. That's avidya. Everything is going to go wrong if that is the case. If you don't know what you are, who you are, then nothing else is going to be right because you can't do anything for yourself because you don't know what yourself is. The immediate cause of that, like what that enables, what is it that we think is us but isn't us? That is asmita. That's the second stage of the problem. The second stage of the problem is drashtri drishayor ekatat. To think that the perception is the perceiver. So just to explain this, because this is kind of deep in the concepts of Vedic psychology. The concepts of Vedic psychology is that the I, the ego, is the perceiver, the drashtri, the one who sees, the experiencer, the perceiver. The one who sees through some kind of mechanism. Just like now you see me through a screen, which is coming through some telephone lines, which is coming through a camera, right? So there's all kinds of tools involved in the perception. Similarly, the actual I, the perceiver, perceives reality through some tools of perception. And the mistake that's at the root of all the problems is to misidentify the perception as the perceiver. So, for example, when you're perceiving pain, Asmita is to be so infatuated with the perception that you absorb yourself into it completely. So you are the perception. When you feel pain, you feel that you are pained. When you feel pleasure, you feel that you are pleasure. When you feel angry, you feel that you are angry. When you see a flower, you feel that you are seeing the flower. So it's an infatuation with the perception that's called asmita, which allows the ignorance or the avidya to fully manifest itself as making us feel that we are something which we are not. Then that is going to really cause all of the problems, because it's natural for anybody to try to work for their own benefit. But if you don't know who you are or what you really are, you'll work for the benefit of something that isn't really you. So you'll be trying to fix problems and everything for yourself that aren't really your problems. So after the perception, when the perceiver becomes the perception, then it has this next layer of problems. The next layer of problems is this like kind of dual layer. I want to make sure my face is not behind this. It is. The next layer of problems is a kind of dual layer of like a two-sided coin. It's counted as two different problems, but it's actually two sides of one problem. One side of the coin is called raga, and the other is dvesha. So raga basically means love, and dvesha basically means hate. Not love in the ideal sense or the word love. It's the simple sense of the word love, like I love cookies. Or, oh yeah, I love baseball. Not the relationship thing or a thing between people or something. It's the love, like the intense like something. That's raga. And then the opposite of it is dvesha. So that's based on asmita. Asmita is infatuation with perception. Once we have infatuation with perception, the next problem becomes that we become very obsessed with getting good perceptions and very obsessed with avoiding bad perceptions. That's what raga is, and dvesha is. Raga is, man, I had this nice perception. I want more of it. And dvesha is, man, I had this awful experience and I want less of that. I don't want bad. That is the problem that we are facing most of the time. This is the one that you actually notice all the time. You're not really noticing the deeper level problems. They're more like subconscious problems. That the problem of avidya, we're too probably infatuated to even notice that it's there. Even the infatuation with perception, we're not really noticing that we're something different from the perceptions. But the one that we really are noticing all the time is the problem is, I'm bored, or I'm uncomfortable, or I'm in anxiety, or I'm thrilled, or I'm excited, and I want more of it. So these are the real problems. How do I get more money? How do I get less cancer? How do I get more friends? How do I get less enemies? How do I get more beautiful hair? How do I get less ugly zits? That's the thing that is constantly, some version of raga and dvesha is constantly bothering us and pushing us to try to work, to figure out how we can satisfy these mental pushings, which are based on satisfying something which is not even us. So those are the two problems that are the real problems. And if you guys have real questions that are on this topic, I'll be happy to look at those for sure. But there's one more layer which goes on top of this and kind of wraps the whole thing up, and is kind of sort of like simultaneously a subconscious issue and also a very, very conscious issue. It is called Abhinivesha, which is also, this word is a very difficult word to translate. People say it's being afraid of dying, but it does actually come to mean that, but it doesn't really mean that. Abhinivesh means to completely invest yourself in something. And so what's going on here is it's not really such a problem to have raga or dvesha. Not a big deal. You feel like I want more tacos or I want less cold. Actually, it can be very useful to have a raga or a dvesha. It's raining out. I want dry. That's going to be very healthy for you. You know, I'm in pain. I want to move my hand off this fire. That's also a very good dvesha, right? It's not necessarily a problem to have raga and dvesha, but the problem really comes to its culmination in abhinivesh, which is to completely invest oneself into the raga and the dvesha. So the product of abhinivesh is this feeling or the sensation that this is all there is. This is what I am. It's not just this is what I am. For example, the perception is the perceiver, right? That's the asmita. That's a very core problem there, right? But it's almost impossible to perceive without that, because you won't really pay attention to a perception if you think it's irrelevant to you. So it's not really such a crucial issue to have asmita, but the crucial issue is to have abhinivesh. The abhinivesh is that the perceiver is the perception, and that is all that it is. That's the problem. Actually, the perceiver is the perception a little bit, because the perceiver is interacting with the perception. But it's much more than the perception. It's the basis of the perception that is ignored with the problem of abhinivesh. Abhinivesh thinks, this is what I am, this is all that I am. I am happy, and that's all that I am. At that point, it's not a problem, but it also becomes, I am suffering, and that is all that I am. I am this person with this flesh and this bones, and that's it. That's why people think of it as fear of death. It's the fear that if I fail to satisfy the raga and satisfy the dvesha, then I have failed absolutely. If I fail, and what is the ultimate raga and the ultimate dvesha? The ultimate simplest raga is I want to survive, and the ultimate dvesha is I don't want to die. But abhinivesh is to give oneself to that raga and dvesha so completely that we think, if I fail to survive, then I am it. It is done. It is finished. It's over. No aspect of me, no nothing will survive that. When I die, it's done. So this intensive fear of death is really the problem. These are the real problems that cause all of the other problems. Not just in your life, like where you feel, where you have anxiety or distress or something like that, but also the problems, things like Gaza, things like international wars, people, not all kinds of social problems, political problems. These actually come down to this: avidya, the root thing, thinking that I am what I am not, and therefore, if I don't satisfy this thing, which is actually irrelevant and unimportant, then I might as well be dead, or I might as well destroy the world. So that sums it up. That's what's really wrong with us. Abhinivesh, which is built from avidya. Well, let's see if there's any questions about it. And if not, you can just keep it concise like that. Hi, Pallavi. Thank you. Blue, green. Huh. Any questions? What if someone tries to flip the raga dvesha? Not sure. What do you mean? Like, if you try to flip the raga and the dvesha? So, for example, you want to like pain and hate pleasure. It is possible to do that, and maybe there's some types of yoga, and there's some types, maybe approaches to there's many different approaches to discipline, to psychological therapy, which are valid and which can work, but some of them are not as universally applicable. Some of them would only work for very few people. So it's very unnatural to try to flip the raga and the dvesha. There isn't really too much point to flipping a raga and dvesha, because then you still have raga and dvesha. You just flip the subjects around. The way to undo the problems is to disassociate the perceiver from the perceived. To practice the disassociation of the perceiver from the perception. So to be aware of what constitutes perception and what constitutes a perceiver is pretty important. To be aware that, for example, the light that is making the shapes that I'm seeing has currently sucked me entirely into the experience of these shapes and these colors and these forms. But to take a step back and realize that I'm perceiving this. It's, in modern psychology, it's called disassociation, and it's considered kind of a trait of trauma. But the yoga therapy is to be able to make the mind intentionally disassociate voluntarily so that it can avoid the trauma, which is inherent in raga and dvesha and abhinivesha. Sophia asks, how do we understand who we are? So that's what it is. You are the perceiver. It's not. It's easy, really. You're the perceiver. You're not the perception. So just practice that, and that is like the rest of the Yoga-Sutra gives very practical, step-by-step guidelines to the therapy of how you practice on experiencing the perceiver. Not just distinct from the perception, but even experiencing the perceiver as the perception of the perceiver. Yes. Disease. Mistaking the identity is the core of all the problems because it causes violence. Mistaking the identity of the perceiver as the perceived means that, for example, this is my land and it's not your land. This is my house. This is my body. This is me, and I must defend it at any cost against you, and I must keep you out of it. So that whole territorialism, which everybody knows is the root of all wars, is based on Abhinivesha, misidentification of oneself as an entity which has some ragas and dveshas. And the other one, all the other causes of wars is greed. And what's greed except raga and dvesha? So indeed. Alfonso says, but the idea for us to experience such a misperception, otherwise what will we be here for? We are permanently identified, then this experience with being would be unnecessary. If you're happy with perceiving the misperception, then there's no problem. And it's not impossible to temporarily achieve that condition. And that temporary thing can be extremely long. But when you come to be dissatisfied with the experience of this problem, then it's not your purpose anymore. Then you might say, why is it happening in the first place? This is a very difficult question to answer, but it's based on the idea that there has to be alternatives. Otherwise, there's no meaning to something which expresses a choice or a volition. So if there isn't an ability to ultimately to not understand the perceiver, then there's no meaning to dedication towards the perceiver. And if there's no meaning to dedication towards the perceiver, then there's no real actual pleasure. There's a different kind of pleasure than raga and dvesha. It's called ananda, which is in the experience of the perceiver and in interaction with the perceiver instead of the perception. But that would have no meaning. The mode of interaction with it is voluntary. And that is how the pleasure is derived. And so there would be no meaning to that if there wasn't some other option. Hence, there is some other option, and in order for that other option to exist, there are us. Here we are. Jonathan asks, even though we intellectually may understand that this is not all there is Abhinivesha. Yes, Abhinivesha is emotionally ingrained, so much so that you will even see it in, you will even obviously see all these mental functions, for example, are not just limited to human beings. All creatures, living things, are what they are because of these 5 kleshas. So you will even see Abhinivesha very obvious in just the simplest of life forms. The very simplest of life forms are always trying to avoid death and always trying to reproduce and make, extend life. And then in human beings, you'll notice it even when a person is really, done a lot of progress in not being dominated by raga and dvesha and not having a lot of asmita and really not really very strongly influenced by avidya, you'll still see Abhinivesha in the reflex to survive, because it's just the most basic. So this is why Patanjali says that these kleshas are part of the matrix of the mind itself. And so he's going to say the therapy for these kleshas is to eliminate their symptoms, which are the vrittis. And the elimination of the symptoms allows a person to comprehend what health is, what mental health is. And then it's the comprehension of the mental health which causes the infirm mind to dissolve. And the entity rebuilds a new mind. So the kleshas, like Abhinivesha and stuff, they can't be washed out of the mind entirely until the mind itself has to be thrown in the garbage and replaced. But compared to what you or I are experiencing right now, the therapies that the Vedic yoga system offers are fantastic. So just to get rid of the symptoms of the kleshas is an amazing progress. Yes, so if you have a panic attack and you feel like you're dying, then that is Abhinivesha. So you can try to understand that. See, the thing that's also very difficult with a panic attack is the overwhelmingness of it. And it's very difficult to even identify anything else except the panic. The anxiety becomes everything. That's Asmita. If you can actually just take a step back and feel a difference between the sensation and the perceiver of the sensation, of the anxiety even, then you can start to poke the Asmita. You poke the infatuation and say, hey, I know you're there. And I know that you're the one that's making me pained by this pain. I'm anxious about this anxiety because of the Asmita. And I know that I'm something else, and I'm just going to wait until this thing goes away. Blue Green asks, is Abhinivesha inevitable? Maybe it's healthy. So it is actually a basic mechanism that keeps living things alive. So it's not really, you won't really be able to get rid of it then unless you have a different way to exist. Because non-existence is impossible for the existent. So it's really, this is maybe a very esoteric point, but what Patanjali says in Yoga-Sutra is you can't get rid of the kleshas entirely. You can't get rid of these problems entirely. You can completely nullify their effects, however. But the only way to get rid of them entirely is what he calls, what does he call it? Samadhi. It's not sub-beach samadhi, it's near-beach samadhi, which is this perfect absorption in the perception of the perceiver itself. So in other words, at that stage, then you transfer yourself into a completely different experience of existence. And you leave behind all the mental apparatus and everything that is infected with the asmitas, with the kleshas. So it's not really like you want to try to stop Abhinivesha. But you should, what the therapy is really for is to be more aware of Asmita. Be more aware of neglecting to distinguish the person who's perceiving from the perceptions. I feel sad. Cool. I feel sad. It's something that I feel. It's not something that I am, which means that I become more aware that this feeling is transient, but the feeler is not transient. That will cause a relief, immediate and significant relief. Same thing with the anxiety. The anxiety is transient, but the person who's in anxiety is not transient. Thank you, Overthought, blue-green. Blue-green, I agree. Hey, Stephanie. All right, so, wait, this is such an interesting name. The Giant Super Fun Bungee Hotel. So here's a question. So we are all part of the one, or Brahman, and all perceiving as individuals, or so we wrongly think. Truth is we are a collective of perceivers, and if we awaken to that fact, we suffer less. The truth is really that the thing which is meant to be perceived is the perceiver. That's the real truth. So there's this stuff called Prakriti, which is what we are assuming is the object of perception. This is really what the Avidya is. To think that the thing which is pretty is ugly, or to think that the thing which is ugly is pretty. So really the Avidya comes down to think that Prakriti is the real object of our focus instead of Purusha. To think that the perception, that the perceiver requires something to be perceived, but the perceiver can itself be a perception. When that experience starts to sink in, or that concept starts to sink in, that undoes Avidya, that undoes Asmita, Ragadvesha, and Abhinivesha. So it's not that the root of the problems isn't that, think we're a separate perceiver or something like that. That is also a mistake. But the root of the problem is that we think the thing which is supposed to be perceived is the thing which is not necessary to perceive. You don't need to experience inanimate objects that you try to animate with your investment of your love and your affection. You need to experience the animator. When you're experiencing the animator, all kinds of other amazing things are there in that experience. The perception of the oneness of perception. And it is not that you cease to become a perceiver, but you start to become aware of the oneness of all the perceivers. So hopefully that makes some sense. Z says, is it possible to correct our perception completely, or are we meant to have this? As I explained a little bit earlier, in a sense, you're meant to correct it. You can't correct it if you don't have it. So you're meant to correct it. That's the glorious thing about you, is that you'll be somebody who corrects this misconception, which in a sense is even greater of an achievement than to be somebody who didn't ever have it, the problem. I explained it earlier. Also, I think Ari maybe asked this question. What is the cause of our It's connected again. So I'm just asking about Ari's. I'm just looking at Ari's question. What's the cause of avidya? There's not a cause to it, and this is an important thing, because you go to infinite regress is a significant philosophical problem. Infinite regress is like the chicken and the egg conundrum. So at a certain point, you have to say these cause and effects are interdependent. Therefore, neither of them could have existed before another. So they must be simultaneous or eternally existent. And because something is eternally existent, it doesn't mean that it can't end. That's another interesting thing. Things can be eternal in the sense of not having a beginning. But some things which have a beginning don't have an end. And some things which do have no beginning, some things which don't have a beginning do have an end. For example, avidya is the classic example of something that doesn't have a beginning, but it can have an end. And moksha is something that has a beginning and doesn't have an end. So, is Ari a inherent defect? The reason why it's a defect, the reason why it's there, we can call it a defect. It's not really a defect. The purpose that it serves is that it gives meaning to the volition of not having the defect. Eaton asks, what are the signs of a psychologically healthy person who has bhakti? The simple signs is you'll notice that they don't have a very strong Abhinivesha. So they don't really wrap themselves up into external experiences too much. And so they don't have very strong ragas, they don't have very strong dveshas, they don't have very strong preferences for irrelevant things which they deem to be irrelevant, which is most of the stuff that people consider relevant, yet they're very, very content with things that are naturally available within themselves. So the signs of a psychological person is joy. psychologically healthy person is joy. Self-contented joy. All right. So we'll call that one live stream session. Thank you for joining me, and I hope that is very useful.